right, I'm going to introduce the next speaker. So this next session is less of a presentation full on with just a few minutes of questions. It's more a few-minute presentation and a lot of time for questions. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to flip the format where people can actually ask questions about deployment from someone that has talked to thousands of people about their deployments around the globe. So Owen is with Hurricane Electric. He's IPv6 Evangelist there and probably does some other things other than evangelizing. But he's out and he's talking to the community about their IPv6 deployments. And he's doing that with his company, and he's being invited by shows and conferences and other places to go talk to people. And he's working with outreach efforts around the globe, and he's actually standing on booths and talking to people. He's standing on the stage and talking to people. He's doing all kinds of things. But to simplify that, he's talked to thousands of people about their IPv6 deployments or what it is that they need to do. So this is an opportunity for you to ask questions from that person that's talked to just about everyone else and get answers. To either get answers about what other people are doing or to get direct answers for your technical questions that you have right here at this event. So as Owen is giving his introductory presentation, be thinking of things that you'd like to ask, but not only things that you need to know, but think about the things for the folks that are your peers. Maybe you're a small provider and you have some small provider peers out there and they couldn't come to this show. They couldn't join us today. I'm sure that you can imagine some of the questions they might have. Bring those questions to the microphone and ask Owen about them. This is meant to be a conversation about deployment with IPv6, and Owen's our expert today. So in addition to being with Hurricane Electric, Owen's also on the American Registry for Internet Numbers Advisory Council and has been for quite some time now. And he's often taken up the role or the plight of the smaller provider inside that space. And it's been pretty interesting to watch him do that. And I know as a volunteer that he's volunteered his time to stand and talk to people about education and outreach efforts around this topic. So it's a pleasure to have him here today, and let's thank Owen DeLong for being here. And welcome.
Okay, thank you, Richard. See if I can get rid of this annoying thing down here at the bottom of the screen real quick. Ah, that wasn't what I wanted. Okay, so mostly this is going to be a Q&A, as Richard said. In addition to talking to people about IPv6, I've also done a fair amount of IPv6. You know, why is v6 important? Well, we've all seen this graph. We all know we're out of v4 addresses in the global free pool. We all know that APNIC is pretty much out of addresses as well, right? Coming soon, and you know, it's just going to keep snowballing from there. I've been an IPv6 proponent since about 2004. I've been a major contributor to IPv6 policy at ARIN. I authored the first IPv6 policy in the world to actually provide for end-user assignments. And I was a significant contributor to recent revisions to the IPv6 end-user assignment policy. So if you've got questions about that, I can help you with that. And I also authored the most recent, far more liberal ISP policy that's just been adopted at ARIN as well. Hurricane Electric runs an international backbone network. We're the most widely connected IPv6 backbone on the planet. We have an open peering policy, so if you want to talk to me about peering afterwards, please feel free. We're a very early v6 adopter, and we have a completely dual stack network everywhere now. What are we doing for dual stack for IPv6? Well, first of all, like I said, all of our backbone and services are full dual stack everywhere. We treat v6 as a production service. It's not second class in any way in our network. There's no differentiation in our support for v6, dual stack, or legacy IPv4. We operate the world's largest tunnel broker setup. It's free, it's easy, there's training and setup assistance available, and we also have a professional services arm. Feel free to talk to me if you're interested in any of that later. And basically, v6 boils down to a choice. You know, do you want to join this lady at the beach with her v6 network working great and you know, life is good, or do you want to join this ostrich out in the African outback, thinking that v4 is fine, we just need more NAT? And with that, we open it up to questions. Here's your chance.
thought this might would happen, so I'm going to go first. And I'm going to encourage you guys to get up and do this after I'm done. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question or two that I've actually heard asked of this type of session before. So we did this session in Buenos Aires last month. And when the presenter gave the first few minutes of presentation, we had John Brzezowski from Comcast do this in Buenos Aires. John gave his presentation, and he put the question mark slide up and said, okay, now come ask your questions. And it was complete crickets around the room. And once we got the questions going, things picked up a bit. But this is very important. This is your opportunity to get information about how you might move forward and deploy IPv6. Now, when we go out there and we look for information about how we deploy, what's the first thing that we do? We hit a search engine. We say, okay, is there anybody else out there that's done this yet? And we look for information about other people that have done this. People are pretty stingy with their information though, right? So if they're your competitor or something like that, they don't want to tell you a whole lot about what they've done. But you're going to find a few resources out there where there's some really good information. And there are some excellent organizations out there that can actually come and help you do these things. But free and open information hasn't been too plentiful about IPv6 deployment over the years. And we're going to try to change that through some efforts that we're doing here. But this is your opportunity today to ask someone your specific question and get an answer, and I encourage you to do that. So, please come to the microphone. I'll ask a quick question to get it started. So, in doing a lot of work over the last couple of years, talking to people about V6 deployment, they often ask the first question, if I'm a small internet service provider, what's the first thing that I need to do to get myself started? What's the highest value thing that I can do right now to get myself started with IPv6 deployment?
Turn up a couple of peering sessions and start deploying V6 in your core. Obviously, you want to start with a laboratory deployment first to know what you're doing to your routers before you touch the production network. But the first production step you really want to take is get a peering session or two up and then deploy it across your core. And everything else kind of falls out from that. Because anything else you could do with V6 is going to depend on having that basic minimum connectivity first. Next.
This may sound naive. When I first heard of IPv6 with a gazillion IP addresses, it was about everyone getting their own IP address for their fridge, their stove, their computers and stuff. If this is going to happen, does this mean that routing tables will exponentially grow as well because everyone will have their own subnet that will have to get routed? Or will it remain pretty much like the current system where IP blocks really remain within the realm of the ISP and are not transportable?
Yeah, the majority of the routing table is still going to be provider assigned, and so even though you get a /48 for your home, which allows you to deploy 65,000 subnets in your house, each of which can contain 18 quintillion hosts in terms of raw numbers, it's still only a single /48 as far as your provider is concerned. And that 48 is part of their larger 32, 28, 24, whatever that they advertise out to the internet. It's not like everybody's household /48 needs to get into the full routing table unless they're actually multi-homed. Like at home, I am multi-homed. My 48 does make it into the global routing table, but that's more the exception than the rule.
Okay, so there's not going to be the equivalent of number portability for the telephone in IPv6?
At least not today.
So one of the questions we were talking about offline, I know that a number of other smaller ISPs that are going through the same thing are going to be asking the same question, and so I thought maybe we'd just talk about it here. The dual stack, is something that I think is relatively clear. I think most ISPs can move through with dual stack. But what happens that day when the last IPv4 number is no longer available and you can only give a subscriber an IPv6? And we talked a little bit about the evils of carrier-grade NAT, but what are the options when your content providers are still on v4 and all you have is v6?
Well, so there's going to have to be a certain amount of carrier-grade NAT or NAT64 or whatever in order to support that legacy v4. The deployment of carrier-grade NAT in that scenario is not what I would consider to be the big problem that was being discussed earlier with carrier-grade NAT. The big problem that I perceived earlier is that there are actually ISPs considering carrier-grade NAT as an alternative to deploying v6. That would be a very, very bad state for the internet to get into because it's a severely degraded service for those users. I think that the v6 only users that have carrier-grade NAT-based access to the v4 internet are actually going to be one of the major pressure points on content providers. You know, right now, Google's afraid to turn on Quad A records because of somewhere less than 0.01% of the internet that is, you know, has some form of broken v6. Well, as soon as more than 0.01% of the internet has broken v4 or no v4, then that kind of flips that equation around, and Google becomes afraid not to deploy Quad A's. So that's really the amount of growth that we need in the end user realm to start being able to really push the content providers, is to get more than 0.01% of the end users to the point where they're v6 only. And I think that's going to happen relatively soon at this point, given the rate of growth in the Asia-Pacific region. Asia was burning through 2 to 5/8s per month most of last year. They've slowed down a little bit because they ran out of space, but you know, they're continuing to deploy a lot of v6. There are v6 users we are seeing in the Asia-Pacific region that appear to have limited, if any, v4 access today, and that's only going to grow. And so I think as that starts to grow and starts to expand to other regions, you're going to see content providers really have to start reconsidering this, well, we don't really need to do it yet, attitude that they've had so far. And I think you're seeing the smart and larger content providers already take the lead on that, and I think you'll see more of that going forward as things go.
Thank you.
Hi, with regards to the allotment that a customer gets, I know Aaron, I think, still states /48 is what's supposed to be designated towards the customer. Just last week I was reading a nice dialogue how some guys are saying /64, and I think another one says /56, but what do you believe is the recommended allotment that a business customer should get?
Well, as a lot of the people in this room already know, I'm a big proponent of 48s. The only reason to give a customer less is because you want to be stingy with addresses, which doesn't make a lot of sense in v6. So I just don't see any benefit to giving a customer less than a 48, and there are a lot of good reasons to do that. I'm sure there are operators in the room that have some disagreement with that, and they're welcome to come to the microphone.
Now, if you deploy a CPE, normally with some ISPs you have a point-to-point of a /30 between the CPE and the network, and then the public /whatever behind the router. For an IPv6 deployment, should that point-to-point connection be like a /64, or should we go with like a 127?
Well, I like to use 64s. We use 64s for that at Hurricane. It keeps everything nice and simple. There's no real benefit to not using a 64. There are some broken router implementations that at this point are mostly historical that led to the possibility of what's called a ping pong attack, which was a form of denial of service attack that was possible if you had only 2 devices in a 64 and you numbered them 1 and 2. But these days, that's mostly a thing of the past. Most of the router vendors have fixed those bugs, and so there's really not a lot of reason left not to deploy 64s. But you can do 64s, you can do 127s, you can do 126s. There's some people out there that are pushing for 112s, which doesn't make any sense at all to me, but that's doable. Some people like 96s. It's really pretty arbitrary, but you can do whatever you want. 64s are easy.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Sweeting.
Hey, Owen, just a quick question. As a global carrier there at Hurricane, do you guys have any insight or heard anything of the brokenness that's caused by CGN over in Asia where it's been deployed already?
We haven't seen a lot of it just yet. We haven't seen a lot of CGN deployed yet, at least not in a way that it's particularly visible to us. But we don't run a lot of the things that tend to break under CGN, so I'm not sure how visible that would be to us. We're not the ones that get the phone calls from the customers that can't get to stuff. So it's really hard. We're not really in a position to evaluate that. We do see more V6 traffic every day from Asia.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, my name's Rick. I work for AS 15290. So we sell primarily to enterprise type clients. And I was thinking about the gauntlet that was thrown down before to say, like, step up and tell us why we're taking so long to get to things. And one of the challenges for us, at least for me, is our operations folks are reluctant to step up, let's say, because of whatever variety of reasons, because they think they need to know everything possible about IPv6 before they're prepared to answer the phone with a customer or deal with problem escalation or that kind of thing. So in your travels, how have you actually seen operators approach the whole training and readiness aspect?
Well, Newton's first law of motion really comes into play here, right? A network operator that doesn't need to learn anything new won't learn anything new.
Exactly.
So at a certain point, this really is going to require management buy-in, and it's going to have to come down from on high that this needs to happen, and the network operators and the network engineers are going to learn this stuff. It actually isn't that hard once they start trying to learn it. It really boils down mostly to 96 more bits, no magic. So like 95% of their V4 skills apply to V6, and there's like 5% new stuff they need to learn. Most of it can be covered with a room full of competent network engineers in about 4 hours.
That's good, because that's kind of the way we're pushing it right now too.
Yeah.
But
And I do a lot of these training sessions, by the way, for various operations groups where I come in and I spend 4 hours bringing them up to speed on what they need to know about V6. And it really just isn't that hard. So the biggest thing is you got to overcome inertia. And the way you overcome inertia is you add thrust. And the only place you can really add thrust is from management down.
so I'm going to go back and say, well, Owen said it's easy, so let's go.
Sounds good. I like it.
Yeah, I do want to let folks know from this DoHub resource that we're doing at the Internet Society, we will be featuring organizations that do come in and provide training services or consulting services and those types of things. So once we get this thing rolling, we get it launched next month, you can go there and you can find folks that are in your area or folks that are nearby that can help you out if you need it. But since no one else is at the microphone, and I encourage you to take your question to the microphone, please, I'm going to ask another question. One is a bit of clarity, and then I have another question. So there was a question just a moment ago about, what size do I assign to my, my enterprise customer downstream, and we had talked about assigning /48s to them. Because /48s are allowed by policy, right? Assign
Yeah, and that's a /48 per end site,
right,
not per end customer. So if you've got a customer that's got 23 buildings, you're perfectly fine giving them 23 48s.
From more of a policy perspective, I know that you're on the advisory council at ARIN. Are there any penalties for a provider in this room if they were to go out and say, okay, I've decided on my address plan. I'm going to assign /48s to these end sites, to these customers, to their sites. Are there any potential penalties for those folks if the community comes in later and decides that, okay, /48s are no longer acceptable to default assigned to an enterprise, and now it's going to be a /56? Do you foresee any problems for those addressing plan decisions that people made today if the policy is changed in the future, or is that not going to be retro or whatever?
It would really depend on the nature of the policy change. I can't really speak to policy that doesn't exist yet, but I will say that I think such a policy change is pretty unlikely. The current trend in policy has been to make the assignments more liberal, not less liberal, and I don't see any reason that trend would reverse anytime in the foreseeable future at the ARIN level.
Okay, and just one more clarity question about portability of the prefix that you receive. So if I'm an end user customer to a internet service provider and that ISP gives me a /48 in IPv6, I don't count that as portable. I can't bring it when I leave that provider someplace else. However, is there a difference inside the policy space in North America, IPv4 versus IPv6, that makes the ability to get provider independent address space, is it easier in V6 or is it the same as it is with V4?
It's now a little bit easier in V6. We've just recently relaxed the IPv6 end user policy quite a bit, actually. but I believe it still requires either multi-homing or some other form of compelling need for a relatively large site. It's a little bit nebulous in its definition of the exact requirements in the new policy, so it's kind of up to a certain amount of Aaron staff discretion, which I think was intentional because we really don't have enough operational experience with these PI assignments to know what should or shouldn't be approved, and we know that the Aaron staff is pretty good at reacting and doing the right thing with new challenges.
Okay.
Had a question come in over Twitter, and it said, well, so it says, please describe the myriad of ways in which it was easier to deploy IPv6 than the naysayers led you to believe. And I'm asking you this. So,
yes. Well, let's see. I was never led to believe that it was hard to deploy v6 by the naysayers. So, but in general, you know, when I looked at turning v6 on, I started turning it on, and it just turned on and worked, and my equipment worked, and I brought up my tunnel, and I brought up my routing, and that worked. And you know, the biggest challenge that I faced was there were some syntax challenges with getting v6 exactly right in the Apache config files, and when you specified a name-based listener, it would only listen on the v4. You still had to spell out the v6 address, and a couple of other things like that. But those were the biggest challenges in deploying v6 in my network. Obviously, Hurricane as a service provider ran into some bigger challenges, but most of the bigger challenges we ran into at Hurricane were things like the vendor isn't ready to do that yet on the router that we purchased, so we had to go push them to get the software ready. So now that part's easy for those of you that come later, and it's already there in their software, and you can just turn it on. APIs weren't well documented. Well, we went back and wrote some documentation and provided that back to the community, so now the APIs are a lot better documented. Things like that. But as a general rule, 96 more bits, no magic really does fit. It really does describe the situation. It just isn't that hard once you start moving, once you start actually doing it. It's pretty straightforward at this point. Next question.
Do you have a 30-second version of y/48 instead of 56? Or some other number?
Sure, although it might be more than 30 seconds. Basically, when you start looking at the possibility of using prefix delegation to build automated hierarchical topologies and arbitrary topologies in the home, it rapidly becomes apparent that you need to support some level of arbitrary breadth and depth. With 8 bits, which would be a /56, you can either get lots of breadth and a little bit of depth, or lots of depth and a little bit of breadth, but you have to make that decision way high up in the tree, and then you're stuck with it all the way down. You can't, you know, do any sort of balancing of trade-offs. 16 bits actually gives you enough of a bit field to play with some pretty flexible topologies and automate that process relatively readily. So there's a reason that the design review of v6 resulted in suggesting 48 as the appropriate size for end sites. It does actually turn out to be a good size for dealing with arbitrary hierarchical topologies that are auto-discovered, and it works quite well. /56 is less optimal, /60 is even worse, and /64 doesn't allow you to really do any level of hierarchy because it's a single subnet.
Yeah, I'm John. So that's your rub. Because you don't NAT v6 anymore, you need that 16-bit to do your internal subnetting for your infrastructure. And then when you NAT with v4, you NAT, so you don't care what you get, right? So that space that you get is actually useful for subnetting your internal infrastructure.
Yeah, but he was talking about, I think, for residential end users. So there are lots of people that are arguing you don't need 65,000 subnets in a house, and that's true, but you do need some level of breadth of subnetting that actually propels some level of depth underneath it. And in order to do that, you need more bits. And the 16 bits turns out to be a pretty good number. Mr. Hughes.
Hi, Aaron Hughes, 6Connect. Comments on a variety of topics. In my experience, the number one problem, the number one challenge with deploying v6 is getting over the V4 mindset. It's not that the technology is all that different. It is that planning is entirely different. When you start to approach deploying V6, checking the box and getting a /32 and going to dual stack your network is not the right approach. It is the approach that we have taken, generally speaking, and we run into trouble. One of the questions was about the challenges and the flexibility of ARIN policy and if it would impact service providers as they're implementing dual stack. And I think there is one that is significant, and that is if I checked the box and I got my shiny new /32 and I started to deploy and realized I didn't have enough space, I'm now faced with the problem that I can't get a subsequent allocation per policy. I have to say, hi ARIN, sorry, I screwed up. I need to have a redo, give back my space. Here's what I actually need, plan appropriately, and redeploy. And that's perfectly fine. We're all going to go through some of these mistakes. Numbering is a bit of a challenge. Policy is not a problem. ARIN is certainly there to help you. But when you go to deploy, it is not just start running. Please do stop and think about the math. Please do stop and think about the possibility, even if it doesn't turn out to be a reality, of using a 48 for everything and round up in big numbers. Also, when people talk about the differences in where you subnet, whether they're 64s, 48s, 36s, 56s, really it's about human readability. It is about your operators being able to read and easily define where things are and how to debug it. So if you're questioning things like whether to use a 64 or a 126 or a 127 on a point-to-point link, and you hear pros and cons about whether there are possible attacks for TTLs on interface, just play on the safe side. Allocate a 64, assign a 126, every interface has a : : 1 or a : 2. You always know your site is : : 1. You always know your customer site's : : 2. If you're assigning a 48, you're just counting numbers up, starting at 0 and going to 65,536. If you have regions that are a bit bigger than 65,536 customers, then sign something larger at the next nibble. Go to the next colon to make it really easy for your operators to read. And on that note, in terms of policy, one nice thing that's changed is as soon as you allocate that tie down, that very large chunk, it is considered utilized by ARIN for requesting more space. So don't worry if you've allocated something really large and you've only got one customer in it. It's utilized.
Well said. For those of you that want more information on address planning, by the way, I'll put out a small plug for the tutorial I'm teaching on Wednesday, I think 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Address planning will be a major part of that tutorial. So if you want to learn more about V6 address planning and how to get that a little bit closer to right on the first try, come to the tutorial on Wednesday. Yes, sir?
Transitioning technologies. When we did our first thing, the first thing we did is we went on IPv6 training, and then we saw all of these different transition mechanism. And should ISPs do some of that or wait to go dual stack? Like, what's your view on all that nasty stuff?
Well, I think you go native dual stack as fast as you possibly can, and you implement transition technologies where you have to get around your inability to implement native dual stack, or to get around your inability to reach something from a V6 only host that's V4 only. I don't think that you deploy transition technologies as a first choice in any case.
Hi, Eric from Executive. I'm curious, most things when you deploy them, the first 80% is easy, relatively speaking, it's the last 20% that kills you. In your experience, what's that last 20% been with Hurricane Electric and anyone else?
Well, so for Hurricane Electric, the last 20% was some of our IT systems. For example, our VPN still doesn't do V6, and that's kind of killing me. I don't have access to the ticket system a lot of the time when I'm on the road, because if I come in over V6, things break. But the reality is that it's different for every organization. It's going to be, whatever that one legacy system that they just can't get to support V6, or that they just can't work around, or that Bob wrote 20 years ago and he left the company 5 years ago, and nobody knows where the source code got left, and the app, the business just can't function without this application, kind of thing. So it's not something I can give a nice universal answer to, unfortunately, but every organization is going to have their own personal last 20%, and it will take somewhere probably less than 80% of the effort, but yeah, it's going to happen. You just got to deal with it, like any other deployment. Mr. Jimerson.
Now, one of the topics that came up the last time we did this in Buenos Aires that people talked about for a few minutes at least had to do with, and I think a lot of people are using this as a catchphrase now when it comes to V4, V6, feature parity. So people were talking about, well, wait a minute, so I've got these network tools and devices that I use to manage my network right now, and I know exactly how those work over V4, and the vendors or the providers that I'm going to be getting these tools from to do it in V6 might be the same. Is there parity between the V4 offering and the V6 offering, and if there isn't, is that a problem? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, of course, the answer to that is vendor dependent to a certain extent. So, the main thing is to ask the vendor for the features that you feel you use most often in their products in V4. Make sure that those features that you care about are going to be present in V6. But try to avoid getting stuck in the mindset of, I need to do everything in V6 the way I did it in V4, because in a lot of cases that really isn't what you want. For example, in V6 we allocated in V4 we allocated one address to a premise, and then we natted everything behind that. Well, we really don't want to do that in V6. We really want to allocate unique addresses to everything, and we want to have stateful firewalls that do good security and good policy enforcement at the edge, of course. We want to do better host security as well, and we want to be able to correlate event logs and audit logs end to end, so that when the address in the web server log of the miscreant who posted the bad blog post is reviewed, we can actually track it back to the system that the user was actually sitting at, rather than being able to track it back to the NAT gateway and then needing to correlate that through multiple other layers of NAT, possibly if CGN is involved, etc. So there are a lot of things that actually get better in V6, and I would argue that to a certain extent there's just no way to bring V6 feature parity to V4 for some of these things. For other things, yeah, V6 isn't quite as mature. DHCP V6 lacks a lot of the things we're used to using in V4 that we're comfortable with. Some of them are getting added back in. Some of it's playing catch up, but there definitely are some things to learn about how auto configuration of addresses in V4 works versus V6. It's a little different, and it's a little bit of a learning curve there. But in terms of feature parity, be really careful about tossing that around as a random buzzword, because in reality, what each person means by feature parity is a little bit different, and what you really mean is, I want the features in V6 that I have in V4 that are important to me, and you need to enumerate what those are to your vendors in order to make your feedback meaningful to them, such that they can actually implement what you want. Next question.
I'm a customer of a small ISP, and they don't have IPv6. They're busy enough running their business. I'm just wondering, obviously me as an individual customer, I can't order them to go IPv6. They'll tell me to go to another ISP. I think there's only one in Canada that was mentioned. Do you foresee the day where transit providers will be the one putting pressures on ISPs to go IPv6 and start dropping V4?
No, I actually think that the content providers will be the one eventually to apply that pressure if it has to come from that direction. Because eventually, as much as people like to talk about, well, it's the end users that are going to run out of V4 addresses, there is going to come a time when content providers can't get new V4 addresses for new web services either. And eventually that's going to drive V6 deployment if it hasn't already gotten there. Now, it's going to be a really sad state of affairs if we let it get to that point, because there's going to be a lot of pain in that process. Because that'll mean that everybody's like way behind the 8 ball, and it just sort of rolls over the internet. Oops.
Are there any recommendations or suggestions on how to push the small ISPs to spend the money to go IPv6 now?
Yeah, call them up and tell them that you want V6 service, and recognize that, yeah, they're going to tell you to go talk to another ISP, and, you know, when your contract comes up, consider doing that. And then, you know, other than that, work around it with a tunnel where you have to. I know where you can get free IPv6 tunnels. With 48s.
Oh yeah, okay. So, Owen, there was another comment out on Twitter as far as, so maybe a government mandate similar to the US TV analog to digital is needed. Do you see that as something that we might need for IPv6?
Well, I don't like the quote that was uttered earlier about, you know, when you see the government pushing something, it's a sure sign that it's dead. But because I don't completely agree with that, but I also don't think that a government mandate is necessarily going to be all that helpful beyond the ones that already exist. There is already a U.S. government mandate through the Department of Defense that they're basically just not going to buy things that aren't V6 capable. That's pushing a lot of the major ISPs in the U.S. that have government contracts to deploy V6 so that they can serve the government. It's pushed a lot of the hardware vendors to be able to do some level of V6 stuff. And I think that we're actually starting to see success without needing a government mandate. And in my experience, when it comes to technology, the government is very good at wording the mandate such that it achieves something other than the desired end result. So I'd like to avoid government mandates where possible, but I do think that government recommendations have been useful. Mr. Hughes.
Just a comment on that topic. I think it'd probably be a bit more like the transition from pulse to touch tone.
Yeah.
In that each of the companies, in this case telephone companies, that have transitioned from one technology to a new technology will have some period of time where they support both flavors of devices. And at some point will reach out to their customers saying, your old device is no longer going to work. Be prepared, you know, January 1, 2013, you're going to need to upgrade. Luckily, people replace their hardware faster than that because there's always the new gaming system, or there's the new cable box that has more features that you don't have, or your printer is just old and crufty and doesn't work anymore. So hopefully, the hardware gets old enough sooner than we run out of resources to run the stuff in the home. But both technologies will be supported for some time, and I imagine at some point we will tell our support staff, if they say, I'm sorry, I'm running Windows XP, you're going to say something like, it's time to buy a new operating system.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think something that could be more useful than a government mandate is to get a consumer awareness campaign going where we basically say, you know, when you're considering your next consumer electronics purchase, if it doesn't say V6 ready, don't buy it. And you know, I'm sure the Consumer Electronics Association would like to lynch me for saying something like that, but I think if we could get something like that going, it would be far more effective than a government mandate.
Along those lines, so a lot of the people in the room here are providers. From the poll from earlier, you know, there are large providers in here, there are smaller providers in here, and the question's been asked a lot over the years, am I ever going to hear about IPv6 from my customer? Is it going to come at me from that direction ever? So I'd like to re-ask that question. So we know that as an industry, we're going to have to do, some of us are going to have to do things like carrier grade or large scale NAT with IPv4. And then we're also going to be deploying IPv6 at the same time. Do you see or have you heard people talking about any types of services out there that consumers are using or might be using very soon that would cause them to go to their provider and say, hey, I noticed that there's something going on with the network here, it's not working the way it used to. For instance, if they're on large-scale v4 NAT, or are there any things out there that you can see on the horizon, or have you heard people talking about that are going to be interesting for consumers with V6 that might cause them to contact their providers?
Well, people like things like Instant Messenger and Skype, and a lot of those actually break through various CGN implementations in a lot of cases. So I think that that alone will probably drive a certain amount of the conversation you're describing. If customers that were not previously behind large-scale NAT start getting stuck behind it. You know, if we get to the point that customers are having to demand IPv6 from the residential ISP, we've failed as an industry to manage this transition correctly, because we really, really, really shouldn't let it get that bad. If the customer has to become aware of what we're doing at the protocol level and demand that we do the right thing, then we have done them a complete and utter disservice.
In Canada, we have something called TPIA, which is a third-party internet access, which allows a small ISP to reach their customers via the major cable companies' infrastructures. In order to do this right now, they have to provide an IPv4 subnet of different number of bits for each CMTS in the major incumbents network. Even if they only have one customer.
That's going to be very interesting in a few years.
And I was wondering, since the talk now is the coexistence in 20-25 years of both V4 and V6, are there any solutions that work that would allow a small ISP to provide only IPv6 between themselves and the end user via the cable, and then do some sort of bridge or whatever within his premises to provide the bridge to IPv4, so he wouldn't have to provision IPv4 to end users? Is there anything on the horizon that will work apart from that?
Not being familiar with all the technical details of CMTS systems, I don't know quite how to answer that question. I will say that, to my understanding, DOCSIS 3 should support V6 end-to-end. So if your end customer doesn't need V4 access and you're willing to provide that customer strictly V6 internet service, that should be completely doable under DOCSIS 3 without any problem.
Okay.
But in terms of providing a V4 transparent solution across that without V4 at the CMTS level, I honestly don't know.
Is there technology that allows you to tunnel V4 over V6?
Absolutely, several.
Okay, because in that case, an ISP then could apply dynamic IPs from one block to any customer on his network.
Yeah.
With the subnets.
Yeah, the term you're looking for is dual stack light.
Light.
Yeah,
okay.
If you do some research on DS-LITE or dual stack light,
okay,
you'll find some work done by the Internet Systems Corporation and Alain Duran and Comcast on the subject, and they came up with this whole thing where the end user gets native V6 and they tunnel the V4 across the V6, and they do the V4 NAT at the carrier end and have assigned private V4 space.
Okay, so it's still NAT at the carrier end, basically.
It's still NAT at the carrier end, but there's no NAT at the customer.
At the customer, okay.
It's assigned private IP space for V4 at the customer end. It's a tunnel through V6 to the carrier NAT, and then NAT to the outside.
Is this going to be some sort of a standard that's established, and if so, how quickly?
Well, there are already RFCs for it, and there is already sample software available from Internet Software Consortium.
So today, a small ISP, as soon as the cable companies offer IPv6 from their premises to the end users, they could deploy that today, basically.
I would think so. Again, I don't know all of the nitty-gritty details of the technology, and this is one of the spaces where the devil's in the details. John, do you know?
You could, but...
Well, John speaks for a cable operator that doesn't have to deal with competitive access, but...
See, the problem with the small ISP right now is they may have, let's say, 2,000 customers, but they need to ask for something like 200 subnets of 16 bits or whatever. And Aaron is not too happy about giving this because utilization rates is not going to be very high on those. And with the shortage of IPv4s coming, that's going to get harder and harder.
Yep.
And at the regulatory level, and we'll find out tomorrow, now they want to have one point. Right now, a small ISP can connect to one region, basically a small number of CMTSs, a POI that we call. What they want now is that one small ISP, when they connect to Rogers, for instance, they connect to their whole network, which means they have to supply a whole bunch of small subnets to cover the whole territory. Which a small ISP now has to go to ARIN and ask for a huge block of IPv4s, which will be underused. So
yeah,
that's going to be a problem.
That's poorly thought out.
Well, the technology right now requires that, and that's why I was sort of asking if they're, you know.
Yeah, you could at least, well, assuming that the carrier network supports V6,
Yeah, that's
you
an
can deploy
assumption.
it into V6 and do it with DS Lite most likely.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure it's a solvable problem. I don't know if I can architect the exact solution up here on stage right now.
Okay. No, I'm just wondering if there was an obvious, that seems to be the obvious. The thing is that because the regulatory stuff tends to take time,
yep.
This is something that ISPs...
And it tends not to take the technology into account.
Yeah, and the ISPs should be thinking about now, yes, so that by the time the regulatory stuff happens, it sort of coincides with the real shortage of IPv4s.
I completely agree.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's a nightmare any way you slice it. Next.
I'm Todd Snyder from RIM. A little bit different track here, not so much policy based, but we've been allocated 332s, one per region around the world, and working with our network engineers, we're having real problems trying to figure out how to manage that space. Not the allocation piece of it, we've got that, but actual, how do you keep track of what's allocated where, what tool sets, what are people using to do that? I wonder if you have an experience with who you've talked to and stuff about what tools they're using just to keep track of it all and allocate it all.
Is Aaron still in the room? You want to address that question, Mr. Hughes? Or do you want me to? So there are a number of different tools. There's 6Connect has an IP management tool. Infoblox provides IPAM appliances. There are other tools out there. Some people use Excel spreadsheets. I don't recommend that. Some people use SQL databases. Most people have some form of provisioning system they use to keep track of their IPv4 blocks. And you know, keeping track of V6 is pretty much the same, it's just bigger numbers. So usually you can take whatever you were using for V4 and do that in V6 as long as you can upgrade the software to handle the bigger bit field.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Crowd goes mild.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Owen.
Thank you.